You are listening to a story exclusively narrated on the Mafia Boss Love Story channel. Relax and step into the world of love stories filled with mystery, emotions, and passion. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment to support us. This content is the property of Mafia Boss Love Story. Please do not copy or re-upload it in any form. The gown had cost $11,000, and Sofia Marchetti thought, as the limousine idled at a red light on a street she didn't recognize, that it would make a very expensive shroud. She didn't know yet that the thought was prophetic. She only knew that the silence in the car had gone on too long, that her new husband's driver, a man named Carmine, who had driven her to church that morning with a cheerful whistle, had not said a single word since they pulled away from the reception, and that the route to the Moretti estate in Lake Forest did not, as far as she could remember from the one time she had visited, pass through a stretch of cracked pavement and shuttered warehouses like the one they were idling in now. "Carmine," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, a small mercy. 18 years of being Salvatore Marchetti's daughter had taught her that steadiness was armor, even when it was a lie. "This isn't the way." Carmine's eyes found hers in the rearview mirror. For just a moment, something flickered there, not malice, but a terrible, resigned pity. "Mrs. Moretti," he said, and the name still sounded strange, borrowed, like a coat she hadn't broken in yet. "I need you to stay calm." Then the world came apart. She would remember it later only in fragments, the way you remember a nightmare after you've been shaken awake. The headlights that weren't there and then were, blinding white and then gone. The shriek of metal as something rammed the limousine's rear quarter and sent it spinning half a turn on the wet asphalt. Her own scream, high and useless, swallowed by the crunch of the passenger door being torn open by hands in black gloves. She would remember the cold October air hitting her bare shoulders where the gown's neckline dipped low, and the absurd floating thought that she'd asked the seamstress for elbow-length sleeves and been overruled. And now she was going to freeze to death, or worse, in this dress that made her look like a sacrifice. Because that was what she was. She understood that now, watching 3, 4 men in ski masks fan out around the wreck of the car with the unhurried efficiency of men who had done this before. That was what she had been the moment her father sat her down in his study 8 months ago and told her, without quite meeting her eyes, that she would marry Michael Moretti before the year was out. A hand closed around her upper arm, dragging her from the ruined limousine. She fought. She would be furious with herself later for how little good it did, for how her nails found nothing but leather and Kevlar, for how her 4-inch heels, chosen to make her look like a woman and not a girl walking down the aisle of her own execution, skidded uselessly on broken glass. Someone's palm clamped over her mouth. She bit down, hard, and heard a muffled curse in Italian, and for one triumphant second thought she might actually break free. Then something hard and gloved struck the side of her head, not enough to knock her out, but enough to send the world tilting, bright spots swimming across her vision, and the fight went out of her all at once. Her body suddenly heavy and unfamiliar, her legs unable to hold her weight. She was lifted. She had a brief spinning image of the wedding gown's train dragging through a puddle, $11,000 of French lace soaking up gutter water and motor oil. And then she was inside another car, the door slamming, the world going dark and quiet and cold. Nobody spoke to her. That, more than anything, was what told her this was not a robbery, not a random horror visited on a rich man's daughter by men who wanted her jewellery. She still wore Michael's grandmother's diamonds at her throat, untouched. But something else, something with purpose. Kidnappers who wanted money talked. They made demands, they postured, they let you see enough of their faces to know they didn't fear identification because you'd never live to identify them, or because they didn't care. These men said nothing at all. They drove in a silence so total that she could hear her own pulse hammering in her ears, and the only sound besides that was the wet rasp of her own breathing through the tears she refused to let herself cry in front of them. She didn't know how long they drove. Long enough that the city lights fell away and the road beneath the tyres changed from smooth asphalt to something rougher. Long enough that her shivering had gone from the sharp shudders of shock to a deep, bone-set cold that made her teeth ache. She sat wedged between two of the masked men in the back seat, her wrists bound in front of her with a plastic zip tie that had already rubbed her skin raw. And she made herself breathe, in for 4 counts, out for 4 counts, the way her mother had taught her to do before piano recitals, before her mother had died and left her alone with a father who saw his daughter as a line item on a ledger. When the car finally stopped, it was full dark, and the air that hit her when the door opened smelled of lake water and pine and wood smoke. Nothing like the exhaust and river damp of the city. She was pulled out, more gently this time, though gentleness from these men felt like being handled by someone who simply hadn't decided yet whether to break you. Ahead of her, through the swimming disorientation of the blow to her head, she saw a house. Not a house, an estate, stone and dark timber, its windows glowing gold against the black bulk of trees, and beyond it, glimpsed between the branches, the flat silver gleam of water that could only be Lake Michigan. They walked her up a wide stone staircase, through a set of doors that opened before they reached them, as though someone inside had been watching for their arrival, and into a foyer with a ceiling 2 stories high and a chandelier that threw fractured light across floors of pale marble. She caught her own reflection in a gilt-framed mirror as they passed, a ghost in torn white silk, mascara tracked down her cheeks, hair that had been pinned into an elaborate crown that morning, now collapsing loose around her shoulders, and didn't recognize the woman looking back. "Where is he?" she said, to no one, to everyone, her voice cracking on the second word. "Where's Michael? What did you do with my husband?" Nobody answered. They led her down a hallway lined with dark portraits she didn't have time to study, up a second flight of stairs, and stopped outside a set of double doors. One of the masked men knocked, twice, a soft, almost deferential sound, entirely at odds with the violence that had brought her here. A voice from within said, "Bring her in." And something about the voice, low, unhurried, edged with a chill that had nothing to do with temperature, made the hair rise on the back of Sophia's neck. The doors opened onto a study. Firelight, dark wood shelves, stacked floor to ceiling with books that looked red rather than decorative. A man behind a desk, not looking up yet, his attention on a folder open in front of him. And even in profile, even in the low amber light, she understood immediately that whoever he was the reason for all of this. Not the masked men. Him. He looked up, Sophia had grown up around dangerous men. She had been raised in rooms where killers sipped espresso and discussed baseball, had learned before she was 10 to read the particular stillness that meant a man in her father's world was calculating something lethal. She thought she knew what dangerous looked like. She had never seen anything like this. He was younger than she'd expected, younger than her father, younger, she thought with a lurch, than Michael. Though there was nothing young in the way he looked at her, nothing young in the flat, assessing patience of his gaze as it moved over her ruined gown, her bound wrists, the blood, was that blood, drying at her hairline. His face belonged in the portraits downstairs, all sharp planes and dark, deliberate stillness, the kind of face carved rather than born. He wore a black shirt, open at the throat, sleeves rolled to the forearm, and there was nothing soft anywhere in him, nothing that looked like it could be reasoned with, or wept in front of, or begged. "Leave us," he said, to the men who'd brought her, and his voice was the same one she'd heard through the door, quiet, unhurried, entirely certain of being obeyed. The doors closed. They were alone. Sophia lifted her chin because it was the only weapon she had left, and because her mother's voice in her memory said, "Never let them see you break first." "Who are you?" she demanded, "and who gave you the right to touch me?" Something moved behind the man's eyes. Not quite a smile, nothing so warm as that, but a flicker of something that might have been surprise, or might have been the first faint edge of interest. "My name is Dante Russo," he said. "And you, Sofia Marchetti." He let the pause sit, let it stretch just long enough to feel like a blade being drawn. "Are going to be here for a very long time." Sophia had expected many things from a kidnapper. Threats, certainly. Perhaps violence, though the thought made her stomach knot in ways she refused to examine too closely. She had not expected him to gesture, almost courteously, at the leather chair across from his desk, as though she were a guest arriving for a business meeting, rather than a bride stolen off a Chicago street. "Sit down," Dante Russo said. "I'll stand." "You'll fall down," he said, without any particular unkindness, "because you're in shock, and you've lost blood, and I'd rather not have my men carry you again tonight. Sit down, Mrs. Moretti." The name landed like a slap. She hadn't been Mrs. Moretti for more than 3 hours, had barely tried the shape of it in her own mouth, had said her vows in a cathedral full of men who kept guns beneath their tailored jackets, and women who wept out of relief that it wasn't their daughters standing at that altar. And already it was being used against her, a taunt disguised as courtesy. She sat, because her knees had, in fact, begun to tremble, and because some small, treacherous part of her recognized that he was right. Dante rose from behind the desk. He moved the way certain men moved when they had never once in their lives doubted that a room belonged to them. Unhurried, economical, dangerous in the specific way of a blade left out in plain sight. He crossed to a sideboard, poured 2 fingers of something amber into a glass, and set it on the low table beside her chair, without asking if she wanted it. "Drink that," he said. "It'll help with the shaking." "I don't want your whiskey. I want to know what you've done with my husband." "Your husband," Dante said, and there it was again. That flicker behind his eyes, colder now, "is alive. For the moment. Whether he stays that way depends entirely on his father, and how quickly Salvatore Nero Moretti understands what's happening to his family." "I don't understand any of this." Her voice cracked, and she hated it, hated the tears that rose, despite every effort to hold them back. "I don't know what you want. I don't know what the Morettis did to you." "I've been married to Michael for 3 hours. 3 hours. I don't know anything about his business. I don't know anything about—" "I know." The interruption stopped her cold. She looked up at him and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't pass, something almost like irritation, but aimed inward at himself rather than at her. "You know," she repeated. "You know I don't know anything, and you took me anyway." "I took you," Dante said, lowering himself into the chair opposite her with the same unhurried economy, "because Rocco Moretti has spent 30 years believing he can do whatever he wants to whoever he wants and never once pay for it. I took you because a wedding ring doesn't erase a debt. And I took you," and here, finally, something in his voice sharpened, went from cold to something closer to a blade's edge, "because 11 years ago your husband's father put a bullet in my brother's skull and left him in a drainage ditch off Route 41 like garbage. And I have been waiting 11 years for the chance to make him understand exactly what that cost." The fire cracked in the silence that followed. Sophia stared at him and felt something shift inside her chest. Not sympathy, not yet, she wouldn't allow herself that. Not for the man who'd had her dragged out of a car with a gloved hand over her mouth, but something adjacent to it, a recognition. She knew grief when she heard it, even wrapped in that much iron. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it, and hated that she meant it. "I'm sorry about your brother, but I had nothing to do with that. I didn't even know Michael's family before 8 months ago. My father—" She stopped. "Your father," Dante said, "sold you." "That's not—" "Salvatore Marchetti owes money to half the East Coast and most of Chicago," Dante said, each word placed with the precision of a man laying out cards he already knew would win. "He's been drowning for 3 years. The Morettis offered to absorb his debts, to fold his crumbling little operation under their protection, in exchange for one thing. You. A marriage that ties your father's name to theirs, that gives Rocco Moretti a legitimate claim to whatever territory your father still controls when the old man finally drinks himself into the ground. You didn't marry Michael Moretti today, Sophia. You were the payment on an invoice." She wanted to tell him he was wrong. She opened her mouth to say it, and found that she couldn't, because some ugly, unacknowledged part of her had known it for months, had watched her father's eyes when he told her about the engagement, had seen relief there instead of joy, the relief of a man setting down a weight he could no longer carry, and had refused, out of some final scrap of a daughter's loyalty, to call it what it was. "You don't know anything about my father," she said, but it came out thin, unconvincing, even to her own ears. Dante studied her for a long moment. Whatever he saw in her face made something in his shift, not softness, she wouldn't call it that, but a recalculation, the look of a man revising a plan that had assumed one kind of target and found another. "Drink the whiskey," he said again, quieter this time. "You're cold and you're bleeding, and tomorrow I'll have someone look at your head. Tonight you're going to sleep in a room down the hall, and there will be a man outside your door, and you are not going to try to leave, because there is nowhere to go. We're 40 minutes from the nearest town, and every person on this property answers to me. And if I scream? Then you'll scream, he said, standing, done with the conversation, in the way he seemed to be done with all conversations, abruptly, absolutely, without appeal. No one will come, no one but me. He crossed to the doors and opened them himself, and the man who'd been waiting outside, not masked now, just a broad, quiet man in his 40s with a face like a closed fist, stepped forward to take her gently by the arm. Marco will show you to your room, Dante said. There are clothes. Someone will have taken your measurements from the dress. You had someone take my measurements while I was unconscious. You weren't unconscious for that part, he said. And something in his voice, not cruelty, not quite, but a kind of clinical detachment that was somehow worse, made her skin crawl. You just don't remember it. She let Marco lead her out because there was nothing else to do, because her legs had gone to water and her mind was a white roar of exhaustion and fear. And it was only as the study doors closed behind her that she let herself look back, once, at the man silhouetted against the firelight, Dante Russo, who had just told her, without a flicker of hesitation, that he had watched her being undressed while she lay unconscious in his house, and who had said it the way another man might mention the weather. She did not sleep that night. She lay in an unfamiliar bed, in an unfamiliar room, in a borrowed silk nightgown that fit her too well to have been chosen by chance, and listened to the wind off the lake move through the trees outside her window, and thought, with a clarity that frightened her more than anything else that terrible day had brought, "He could have killed me tonight, and he didn't. I don't know why, and I don't know if that's supposed to make me feel safer or so much less safe than I've ever been in my life." Morning came grey and sharp, light spilling through gauze curtains onto a room Sophia hadn't had the composure to examine the night before. Now, sitting up in the wide bed with her ribs aching where the seatbelt had bitten into her during the crash, she took inventory the way her mother had once taught her to take inventory of a room full of strangers, quietly, thoroughly, cataloguing every exit. There was only one door, and it would be locked or guarded or both. Two tall windows overlooked a stretch of manicured lawn that fell away toward a line of trees, and beyond the trees, the lake, gunmetal grey under the overcast sky, vast enough that she couldn't see its far shore. The room itself was beautiful in an impersonal hotel suite way. Cream walls, a fireplace already laid with wood, a wardrobe that, when she opened it with hands that still trembled, held a dozen outfits in her exact size, tags still on, tasteful and expensive and utterly without personality, as though someone had asked a computer to generate woman, 23, wealthy, and had these delivered within the hour. She found the wedding dress draped over a chair in the corner, ruined, mud-streaked, and the sight of it undid something in her that the whole terrible night hadn't managed to reach. She sat down hard on the edge of the bed and cried, finally, the way she hadn't let herself cry in front of Dante Russo, ugly and gasping. For her mother, who wasn't alive to help her through this. For a father who had sold her like livestock. For a husband she'd met 4 times before their wedding day and felt nothing for beyond a vague, dutiful dread. And who was now, what? Alive, Dante had said. For the moment. She was still crying when the door opened without a knock. Dante stood in the doorway in a grey sweater and dark trousers, looking, in daylight, even more unnervingly composed than he had by firelight. No trace of the violence of the night before. Nothing to suggest that fewer than 12 hours ago he had orchestrated the destruction of her wedding and her life. He took in the tear-streaked face, the ruined dress on the chair, the untouched breakfast tray someone must have left while she slept, and something crossed his features that she couldn't name, gone too fast to study. "You should eat," he said. "I should go home." "You don't have a home to go to. You have a father's house you're not welcome to return to without shaming him, and a husband's house you were never taken to." He said it flatly, an accounting of facts rather than cruelty, though the effect on her was the same. "Eat something. I have a doctor coming to look at your head." "I don't need a doctor." "You have a laceration above your ear that bled through the pillow last night." His eyes flicked briefly to the pillow behind her, and she followed his gaze and saw, with a lurch of nausea, the rust-brown stain she hadn't noticed. "You'll see the doctor, or I'll hold you still while he examines you anyway. Your choice which version we do." "You're a monster." "I've been called worse," he said, unmoved, and crossed the room to the window, looking out at the grey lake with his hands clasped behind his back, a posture of such deliberate stillness that she understood, suddenly, that this was a man who had trained himself out of restlessness the way other men trained muscle. "Dr. Vitali will be here within the hour. After that, you'll have the run of the house. The east wing, the library, the gardens. Not the west wing. Not my study without an escort. Not past the tree line, because the perimeter is armed, and they will not know the difference between you and someone trying to hurt me." "You make it sound like a hotel." "It's not a hotel." He turned from the window. "It's the only place in the Midwest where you're safe from what's coming, Sophia. I'd think about that before you spend too much energy hating me for it." "What's coming?" Something shuttered in his expression. "Eat your breakfast," he said again, and left, and she heard, faintly through the door, the particular quality of silence that meant a guard had resumed his post outside. She did not eat, not at first, out of some pointless, prideful instinct to deny him even that small victory. But by mid-morning, hunger and the ache in her skull had worn her resistance down to nothing, and she ate the cold eggs and the fruit and the coffee that had gone lukewarm, and hated herself a little for how good it tasted, how her body's traitorous needs didn't care in the slightest that she was a prisoner. Dr. Vitale turned out to be an elderly man with kind eyes and steady hands, who examined her scalp with murmured apologies for the discomfort, pronounced the wound superficial, dressed it, and checked her ribs with a gentleness that made her throat tight with unexpected gratitude. He didn't speak of anything beyond the medical, didn't answer her questions about where she was or who Dante Russo really was, only patted her hand at the end and said in a soft, accented voice, "You're safer here than you know, signorina. Rest now." Before he too was gone, and the door locked, she heard the bolt, unmistakable, behind him. By afternoon, restlessness had driven her from the bed to pace the length of the room, and it was in that pacing that she found, tucked into the wardrobe's lowest drawer, a stack of books, not staged, not part of the impersonal wardrobe's careful curation, but worn at the spines, dog-eared, a copy of The Count of Monte Cristo with handwriting in the margins that wasn't hers and couldn't have been meant for her. She opened the cover and found, in small, sharp cursive, a name, Gianni Russo. and beneath it, in different ink, added later, "Non dimenticare, non perdonare." Don't forget, don't forgive. She sat on the floor with the book in her lap for a long time, turning that name over. Gianni Russo, the brother, the boy in the drainage ditch, and felt the story Dante had told her the night before shift from an accusation aimed at her into something else. A wound. A brother's grief calcified over 11 years into something hard enough to survive a wedding day ambush, a kidnapping, whatever violence was still to come. She did not forgive him. She told herself that firmly, twice, as though repetition could make it more true. But when Marco brought her dinner that evening, and she asked carefully, "Was Gianni Russo Dante's only brother?" The flicker of surprise on the guard's broad face, quickly hidden, told her she'd stumbled onto something that mattered more than she yet understood. "Eat your dinner, Mrs. Moretti," Marco said, echoing his boss's words from that morning, and left her alone with the lake going dark outside her window, and the growing uneasy sense that the man who'd stolen her life yesterday was not the simple villain she needed him to be, if she was going to survive this, with any part of herself intact. By the third day, Sophia had learnt the rhythms of the house the way a prisoner learns a cell. Not out of curiosity, but out of the animal need to understand the shape of her cage. Breakfast came at 8, left outside her door by a young woman named Rosa, who wouldn't meet her eyes. Marco walked the east wing corridor on an hour's rotation with another guard, a leaner, younger man called Enzo, who smoked on the terrace and watched her through the glass with an expression she couldn't decide was curiosity or suspicion. Dante did not come to her again after the second morning, and she told herself she was relieved. She was not entirely honest with herself about that. It was Rosa, in the end, who broke the isolation, sliding into her room on the fourth evening with an armful of towels and a nervous, sideways glance at the door. "Mr. Russo says you can use the library," she said, quick and quiet, Chicago flat vowels roughened by an Italian cadence underneath. "If you want. He said I should tell you. He doesn't—" She hesitated. "He doesn't always say things twice." "Why are you telling me this like it's a secret?" Rosa's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Because it's the nicest thing I've heard him offer anybody in the 2 years I've worked here, and I didn't want you to miss it." The library, when Sophia finally worked up the nerve to leave her room and find it, took up most of the ground floor's western face, 2 stories of shelves reached by a rolling ladder, and a fire that was, she would come to learn, always lit, day and night, as though the house itself couldn't bear to be cold. She was halfway through the door before she realized Dante was already there, in a chair by the window, with a tumbler of something dark at his elbow and a folder of papers on his knee, and she nearly retreated, except that he looked up before she could, and something in his face stopped her. "You found it," he said. "Rosa told me I could." She stayed by the door, unwilling to commit to the room while he occupied it. "I can come back." "Stay." He set the folder aside. "Or don't. It's not a command. A beat. Most things in this house aren't commands, whatever you've decided about me. You had me kidnapped and dragged here at gunpoint. Forgive me if I don't pass the fine distinctions of what is and isn't a command." Something flickered at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, precisely, but its cousin, the ghost of one, there and gone. "Fair," he allowed. "That one was a command. Sit down, Sophia. I'd like to ask you something, and I find I'd rather ask it looking at your face than shouting it down a hallway. She sat, warily, in the chair across from him, keeping the low table between them like a moat. What do you want to know? Your father. He turned the tumbler slowly between two fingers, watching the firelight catch in the amber liquid rather than looking at her, and she understood, with a small jolt, that this was deliberate, that he was giving her room to answer without the weight of his attention pinning her in place. Tell me about him. Why? Because I've spent 11 years building a picture of the Marchetti and Moretti families out of surveillance photos and other men's fear, and none of it explained why Salvatore Marchetti would let his only daughter marry into a family that's been circling his territory like sharks for the better part of a decade. I want to hear it from someone who isn't trying to sell me a version that keeps them alive. Sophia was quiet for a long moment, watching the fire. My mother died when I was 12, she said finally. Cancer. It was slow, and it took almost everything my father had. Not just money, though there was that too. Hospitals and doctors he wouldn't stop paying for, even after the doctors told him there was nothing left to try. It took something else out of him. He was never... She stopped, searching for the word. He was never cruel to me. I want to say that. He just stopped being able to see me as anything but a problem he didn't know how to solve alone. And then the debt started. Bad investments. Money owed to people you don't want to owe money to. By the time the Morettis came to him with an offer, I don't think he saw another way out. I don't think he let himself think about what it would cost me. Or maybe he did, and decided it was a price he could live with. As long as it wasn't a price he had to pay himself. That's a generous read of a man who sold his daughter to save his own skin. Maybe I don't have anything left except generous reads, she said, sharper than she meant to. Maybe that's the only thing I get to keep, since everything else was taken from me without so much as a conversation. Dante was quiet at that, and when she finally looked at him, she found him watching her with an expression that had shed all its earlier careful blankness, something rawer beneath it, something that looked almost like recognition. My father, he said, after a silence long enough that she'd stopped expecting an answer, died when Gianni and I were young. Our uncle raised us into this life because there wasn't another one on offer. Gianni was 17 years younger than me, a mistake, my mother used to call him, laughing, because she loved him so much the word came out like an endearment instead of an insult. I raised him more than my uncle did, taught him to drive, taught him to shoot, taught him which men in our world could be trusted and which couldn't. His jaw tightened. I taught him wrong, apparently. He trusted Rocco Moretti on a deal I told him not to touch. I was in Palermo for 6 weeks, settling a dispute with our cousins there. By the time I came home, my brother had been in the ground 3 days, and Rocco Moretti sent a wreath to the funeral like the two things weren't connected. Sophia felt something in her chest crack open, unbidden and unwelcome. I'm sorry, she said again, and this time the words felt insufficient in a way that embarrassed her. I don't want your sympathy, Dante said, but there was no heat in it, only a great and old tiredness. I want you to understand why I can't simply let this go, whatever else turns out to be true about you. It's not about you, Sophia. It was never about you. You were just standing where I needed to put my hand. That's supposed to make me feel better? No, he said, and met her eyes directly for the first time since she'd sat down. It's supposed to make you understand me. I don't especially care whether you feel better. And yet, she would think later, lying awake with the lake wind rattling the windows, he had lit the fire in the library before she arrived, had told Rosa to extend the invitation rather than issuing it himself in a way that would have felt like another order, had asked about her father in a voice that, for one unguarded moment, sounded almost like he wanted to know the answer rather than needed it. A man who didn't care, she thought, didn't bother with any of that. A man who didn't care simply took what he needed and moved on. She didn't know yet what to do with the suspicion that Dante Russo cared a great deal more than he was willing to admit, to her, or perhaps to himself. The envelope arrived on the 6th day, delivered by a courier no one seemed to know, left at the estate's outer gate, with instructions that it be given to Sophia directly and to no one else. Marco brought it to her with visible reluctance, as though he expected it to bite, and stood in the doorway of the library while she broke the seal, with hands that had, over the past days, stopped trembling quite so readily, a fact she noted with something between pride and grief, that her body was already adjusting to a life inside a cage. The handwriting was her father's. She would have known it anywhere, the same cramped, slanting script that had signed her report cards, her college applications, the marriage contract that had ended her old life. She read it twice before the words assembled into meaning. Sophia, I am doing everything in my power to secure your safe return. Rocco Moretti has assured me the Russo family will be dealt with. Do not trust anything Dante Russo tells you. He is a liar and a killer who will use you to destroy this family and by extension destroy me. I know you are frightened. I am frightened for you. Please, be patient and be strong, and know that your father loves you and is fighting for you. Papa. She read it a third time, and something cold settled in her stomach that had nothing to do with fear of the Russos. He doesn't ask if I'm hurt, she said, mostly to herself, mostly not intending Marco to hear it. He doesn't ask what happened to me in the car. He asks me to trust that Rocco Moretti is handling it. She looked up. Rocco Moretti is Michael's father. He's the one Dante says killed his brother. My father is asking me to trust the man responsible for all of this. Marco said nothing, but something in his stillness suggested he'd expected this reaction, or had been told to expect it. Does Dante know what's in this letter? Mr. Russo reads everything that comes into this house before it reaches you, Marco said. That one he let through unread, said you had a right to hear your own father's voice without him standing over your shoulder. That, more than the letter's contents, unsettled her. She found Dante an hour later on the terrace overlooking the lake, a cigarette he wasn't smoking burning down between his fingers, his eyes fixed on the water, with the particular stillness she'd begun to recognize as thought rather than idleness. You read this, she said, holding up the letter, though he'd apparently declined to. I was told the contents. Marco reports to me. He didn't turn. Your father is frightened, and frightened men say stupid things to make themselves feel like they're doing something. He's not wrong that I'm dangerous to him. He's wrong if he thinks Rocco Moretti has any intention of protecting either of you once this is finished. What does that mean? Now he turned, and the look on his face was grim in a way she hadn't seen from him yet, Not the cold calculation of their first meeting, not the guarded, careful distance of the library, but something that looked almost like pity, aimed past her at a version of events she hadn't yet been told. It means Rocco Moretti agreed to absorb your father's debts in exchange for this marriage, because it gave him a legal claim to territory your father controls the moment your father is no longer useful to him. Which, Sophia, was always going to be very soon. A dying man's daughter married into a hungrier family isn't protection, it's an acquisition. Your father sold you, believing he was buying safety. He was buying himself a few more months before Rocco Moretti finished the job the debt started. You don't know that. I know Rocco Moretti, Dante said, flat and certain. I've studied that man for 11 years, the way other men study scripture. I know exactly what he is, and it isn't a protector. It's a predator who's very good at making his prey believe otherwise until the moment the teeth come out. Sophia stared at the lake, letting the wind off the water cut through the letter's careful, guilty affection, and felt something inside her, some last stubborn hope that her father's love, however flawed, had at least been real, begin to crumble. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, quieter now. "It doesn't help you. If I hate my father and the Morettis both, that doesn't make me more useful as a hostage. If anything, it makes me less predictable, less controllable." Something in Dante's expression shifted. Surprise, she thought, that she'd seen the strategic gap in his own honesty and pointed straight at it. "No," he agreed slowly. "It doesn't help me." Then why? He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped into something rougher, less certain than she'd yet heard from him. "Because I watched my brother die for a lie someone else told him, to keep him compliant. And I promised myself I'd never be the kind of man who does that to someone else. Even when it would be easier. Even when the someone else is a means to an end I've spent 11 years working toward." He looked at her directly then, and the weight of his attention felt like something physical. "You didn't ask for any of this, Sophia. I took your wedding night, your husband, your freedom. I won't take the truth from you too, whatever else I am." She didn't know what to say to that. She stood beside him at the terrace railing, the letter crumpled now in her fist, the lake wind pulling loose strands of hair across her face, and felt the ground of her understanding, of Dante, of her father, of the entire architecture of loyalty she'd built her life on, tilt beneath her, the way it had tilted in the back of a stranger's car 6 nights ago, except that this time nothing was rushing in to catch her. "I don't know what to do with that," she admitted finally. "You don't have to do anything with it," Dante said. "Just know it. That's all I'm asking." They stood together at the railing for a long time after that, not speaking, the water going dark and then darker as the sun dropped behind the tree line, and Sophia found, to her own quiet horror, that the silence between them had stopped feeling like captivity and started, in some small and unwelcome way, to feel like company. 2 weeks in, Dante told her they were leaving the estate, and Sophia's first reaction was a lurch of something that took her an embarrassing moment to identify as disappointment rather than relief. Disappointment that this meant the fragile, unnamed thing growing between them in the library's firelight would have to survive contact with the world outside. "Where?" she asked, and then, because old habits died slowly, Am I allowed to ask that? Or is it another thing I don't get to know? You're allowed to ask. He was checking the chamber of a handgun with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything, and the sight of it, still after 2 weeks, made her chest go tight. The Bella Rosa. It's a club I own downtown. There's a meeting I need to attend, and I'd rather you were where I can see you than left here with half my men in case Rocco decides tonight is the night he stops being patient. You're bringing me to a Mafia meeting. I'm bringing you somewhere with better security than the estate and eyes on every door, he corrected. You'll sit in my office upstairs. You won't be part of the meeting. The Bella Rosa turned out to be nothing like the gaudy, movie-set version of a mob nightclub Sophia had half expected. No red velvet, no gold trim, but a sleek, low-lit space of black marble and blue neon. A bar that ran the length of one wall, a dance floor already filling despite the early hour, and above it all, a mezzanine office with one-way glass that let Dante watch the whole floor without being watched in return. You run a legitimate business too, she said, taking in the office. Leather furniture, a wall of monitors showing security feeds, a bookshelf that looked genuinely used rather than staged. I run several. This one happens to also be useful for meetings I'd rather the FBI's parabolic microphones didn't catch. He said it without inflection, the way another man might mention the weather, and it struck her again how easily he moved between the ordinary and the lethal, as though the line between them had simply worn away for him years ago. Stay up here. Enzo will be at the door. If anyone comes up those stairs who isn't me or him, scream, and don't stop until someone comes. He left her there for the better part of an hour, and she spent it at the glass, watching the club below, watching specifically the private booth in the far corner where Dante sat with 2 men she didn't recognize, watching the particular stillness that came over him in negotiation, the way his hands stayed flat and calm on the table, while whatever he said made one of the men go pale. She was so absorbed in watching him that she didn't hear the office door until it was already open, and turned to find not Enzo, but a woman, tall, dark-haired, dressed in red silk that made Sophia's borrowed cashmere feel suddenly absurdly plain, leaning in the doorway with an expression of open, assessing curiosity. "So you're her," the woman said. "The bride." "Who are you?" "Valentina." She said it like it should mean something, and when Sophia's blank look told her it didn't, something like satisfaction crossed her face. "I've known Dante 11 years, since before Gianni. I was hoping he'd bring me up here eventually, but I didn't expect it would be to introduce me to his hostage." "I'm not—" Sophia stopped, unsure suddenly what she was, and hating that Valentina's small, knowing smile suggested she'd noticed the hesitation. "You're not what, sweetheart? His prisoner? His guest? His—" Valentina's eyes swept over her with a slow, deliberate thoroughness that felt like a challenge. "I've seen him look at a lot of women in 11 years. Business associates, enemies' wives sometimes, when it served a purpose. I've never seen him look at any of them the way he was looking at you just now, through that glass, when he thought no one else could see." "I don't know what you're talking about." "No," Valentina agreed, straightening, some of the challenge fading into something almost gentle, almost like pity. "I don't think you do. That's the dangerous part." She turned to go, then paused at the door. "A word of advice, since you clearly weren't given any before you walked into this life. Dante Russo has spent 11 years turning himself into a man who doesn't feel things, because feeling things got his brother killed. If you're the thing that cracks that open again, and I think you might be, you should ask yourself whether you're ready for what happens to the people around a man like that when he finally stops being careful. She was gone before Sophia could ask what that meant, leaving her alone with the glass, the club below, and the sight of Dante rising from the booth, his expression gone flat and dangerous, in a way that made the two men across from him flinch back in their seats. He came upstairs 20 minutes later, jaw tight, a muscle working beneath the skin that told her the meeting hadn't gone the way he'd wanted. "We're leaving," he said. "What happened?" "Rocco Moretti sent word. He knows you're with me." He crossed to the window, looking down at the club floor with an expression she'd come to recognize as the one he wore when he was doing violence to himself by not doing violence to something else. "He's not asking for you back. He's telling me what he'll do to your father if I don't return you within the week." Sophia felt the floor tilt again, that same sickening lurch from the terrace 2 weeks before. What will he do? Dante turned, and for the first time since the study, the first night, she saw something in his face that looked almost like an apology. "Nothing good," he said. "Get your coat. We're going home." The drive back to the estate was silent, but it was a different silence than the one that had carried her into this life 2 weeks before. Not the airless, terrified silence of masked men and zip ties, but something charged, occupied, full of things neither of them said. Sophia watched Dante's hands on the wheel, the white-knuckled grip that betrayed a fury he wasn't letting reach the rest of his face, and found herself, absurdly, wanting to reach over and loosen his fingers herself. She didn't. Back at the house, he disappeared into his study with 2 of his men and didn't emerge for hours. Sophia paced the library until the fire burned low, then fed it herself, badly, singeing her fingers on a log that rolled from the grate, and was still cursing under her breath and shaking out her hand when the door opened and Dante stood there, looking, for the first time since she'd met him, less like a king surveying his territory and more like a man who'd spent the evening losing an argument with himself. "You're bleeding," he said. "It's nothing. I burned my fingers on the fire, not—" She stopped, because he'd already crossed the room and taken her hand before she finished the sentence, turning it toward the light with a gentleness that felt entirely at odds with everything she knew about him. And something in her chest went tight and strange at the contact, warm despite the sting of the burn. "You could have called for Rosa. I didn't think a burned finger warranted an emergency." "In this house," he said, low, still holding her hand, still examining it with a focus that felt like it belonged to something much larger than a minor burn, "you're allowed to ask for help. I know that's not a lesson anyone's bothered teaching you." He looked up, and their faces were closer than she'd realized, close enough that she could see the fire-reflected gold in his dark eyes, close enough that her breath caught somewhere behind her ribs. "I'm sorry," he said, quieter, "for today. For Valentina, if she said something to upset you. She has a talent for finding the thing that will land hardest and saying it without warning. She said you look at me differently than you look at other people." Something flickered across his face. Not surprise, she thought, but the particular stillness of a man caught in a truth he hadn't intended to have witnessed. He didn't let go of her hand. "She's not wrong," he said, and the admission seemed to cost him something, seemed dragged out from underneath 11 years of careful, deliberate control. I've spent a long time making sure nothing gets close enough to matter, Sophia. It's easier that way, safer for everyone, including whoever I'd otherwise let matter. His thumb moved once, absent and unconscious, across her knuckles, and she felt the touch everywhere. A live wire strung the length of her spine. I don't know what to do with the fact that it isn't working this time. Dante. His name in her mouth felt like something new, something she hadn't earned the right to yet and was taking anyway. What did Rocco Moretti say about my father? The warmth in his face shuttered, replaced by the grim mask she'd seen in the club. He released her hand, and she felt the loss of it more than she wanted to admit. He said your father's usefulness has an expiration date, and that keeping you here is accelerating it. Dante moved to the window, putting distance between them with the same deliberate economy he used for everything. He wants you back, not because he cares what happens to you, Sophia, but because a bride who's been taken by a rival family and not yet returned is an insult he can't leave unanswered without looking weak. If I send you back, he punishes your father for the perceived shame of it, or he punishes you, quietly, in a way that never makes the papers. If I keep you, he escalates, comes for this house, for my men, possibly for your father, regardless, just to prove a point about what happens to families who cross him. So there's no good option. There's rarely a good option in this life. There's only the option that costs the least. He turned back to her, and his expression had gone unreadable again, the mask fully restored. I have people working an angle that might change the calculus entirely. It's not something I can discuss yet, not because I don't trust you, but because if it fails, I don't want you carrying the weight of having known and been unable to stop it. That's not fair. You don't get to decide what I'm strong enough to carry. No, he agreed, something almost like a smile ghosting at the edge of his mouth, gone as quickly as it came. I don't suppose I do. You've made that clear from the first night. When you bit a man's hand hard enough to draw blood, rather than let him carry you quietly. The almost smile faded into something more serious. Give me time, Sophia. I know that's not much to offer, given everything I've taken from you. It's what I have. She studied him in the firelight, the tension in his shoulders, the careful distance he'd put between them that didn't quite manage to disguise how badly, she was beginning to understand, he wanted to close it, and felt the last of her certainty that she hated him crumble into something far more complicated, far more dangerous to her heart than simple hatred had ever been. Time, she said finally. Okay, you have time. She didn't tell him that giving it to him felt less like patience and more like surrender. The days that followed took on a strange, suspended quality, not quite peace, but something adjacent to it, a fragile domesticity that neither of them named aloud for fear of what naming it might cost. Dante began joining her in the library most evenings, not always to talk. Sometimes he simply read across from her in silence, and she found she didn't mind the silence at all when it was his. It was Michael who broke the fragile truce. She hadn't thought of her husband. The word still felt like a costume she'd been made to wear once and never again, with much beyond a distant, guilty pity in days. And so the letter that arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered through the same untraceable channel as her father's, landed like a stone through glass. Sophia, I don't know what that man has told you or done to you, and God help me, I can't stop imagining the worst. I never wanted this marriage any more than you did, but I'm your husband, and I have a right to know you're safe. My father says Rousseau will kill you the moment it serves him. I don't believe that's true. No one is that patient for nothing. But I need you to understand that whatever he's shown you these past weeks, whatever kindness, it's a performance. Men like Dante Rousseau don't feel anything. They calculate. Please, Sophia, find a way to get a message to me. I will come for you myself if I have to. She read it twice, standing in the library doorway, and didn't notice Dante had come in behind her until his shadow fell across the page. May I? He held out his hand, and something in his voice, carefully, deliberately even, told her he was working hard to keep it that way. She gave it to him, watched his face as he read it, watched the muscle tighten in his jaw at "I will come for you myself," watched something colder and older than jealousy, something closer to territorial fury, move behind his eyes before he folded the letter with exaggerated care and set it down. "He's not wrong to worry about you," Dante said, and his voice had gone very quiet, very controlled, the voice of a man holding something back by main force. "But he's wrong about the performance. I don't perform for people I don't need anything from anymore, Sophia. I stopped bothering with that particular skill a long time ago. He wants to come for me. He'll die if he tries." It came out flat, immediate, and something in the certainty of it made her breath catch. "I'm not saying that to frighten you. I'm saying it because it's true, and because if Michael Moretti is foolish enough to bring men onto my territory, I won't have a choice about what happens to him, whatever complicated feelings you might still be sorting through where he's concerned." "I don't have complicated feelings about Michael." The words came out sharper than she intended, driven by something she didn't examine too closely. "I met him 4 times before I married him. I don't love him. I never had the chance to." "Then why does his letter have you standing here white-knuckled, reading it 3 times, like you're looking for something you missed?" "Because he's the only person from my old life who's asked if I'm safe instead of telling me what I owe someone," she said, and the words came out rawer than she meant them to, true in a way that surprised her even as she said it. "That's not love, Dante. That's just someone remembering I'm a person and not a transaction. I didn't realize how much I needed that until it showed up in an envelope." Something in Dante's expression cracked, just slightly, the careful control fracturing enough to show what was underneath. Not just jealousy, she realized, but something rawer, more frightened. The look of a man watching a thing he'd started to want slip towards someone else's claim. "I ask if you're safe," he said, low, and it wasn't quite an argument, more like a confession, dragged out sideways. "Every night. I ask Rosa, I ask Marco, I check the monitors myself before I let myself sleep. I don't send it in a letter because I don't know how to write the words down without them meaning more than I've let myself admit they mean." Sophia went very still. The fire popped in the grate, and outside the wind moved through the pines with a sound like the sea, and she found she couldn't look away from him, from the rare, unguarded honesty on his face, dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with guns or masked men or midnight ambushes. "What do they mean?" she asked. "The words you're not letting yourself say?" For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he crossed the space between them. Not fast, not the deliberate economy of a man closing a business deal, but something slower, more uncertain than she'd ever seen him, and stopped close enough that she had to tilt her head back to hold his gaze. "They mean," he said, voice rough now, stripped of all its careful control, that I took you from that wedding to punish a dead man's murderer, and somewhere in the last 3 weeks I stopped being able to remember why that mattered more than the fact that I can't stand the thought of you reading another man's letter and feeling something for him that isn't mine to be jealous of, and I have no right to be jealous, Sophia, none, given what I did to get you here. And I am anyway. God help me, I am. She didn't move. Neither did he, not for a long, taut moment, the space between them thick with something neither of them had permission to want. And then, very slowly, giving her every chance to step back, he lifted a hand to her jaw, and she didn't step back, and the fire burned low in the grate, while the world outside the library windows went on, not knowing anything at all had changed. He didn't kiss her. That surprised her more than anything else that had happened since the wedding, more than the ambush, more than the study, more than Valentina's knowing smile in the club's mezzanine office. His hand stayed at her jaw, thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with a restraint that trembled at its edges, and for one long, suspended moment she thought he would close the last inch of distance between them, and some traitorous, terrified part of her wanted him to. Instead, he stepped back. "Not like this," he said, and his voice was rough, unsteady in a way she'd never heard from him. "Not while you're still my prisoner, Sophia. Not while there's a version of this where you look back and can't tell the difference between wanting me and needing to survive me. That's not fair. You don't get to decide that for me either." "No," he agreed, and something in his face looked almost wrecked. A man denying himself something he wanted with a violence that mirrored, in its own way, the violence he'd used to take her. "But I get to decide it for myself. I've taken enough from you already. I won't take this too, not until you can give it to me freely, with the door unlocked and every choice in the world in front of you, and you still choose to stay." She wanted to argue. She wanted, God help her, to close the distance herself, to prove that she wasn't so fragile, so confused, that she couldn't tell the difference between fear and want. But some quieter, more honest part of her recognized the gift in what he was offering. The first time in 3 weeks that anyone had handed her back a piece of her own agency instead of taking more of it. And she let the moment pass, aching and unresolved, into something that felt, strangely, more intimate than a kiss might have. "Okay," she said softly. "Not like this." He nodded once, jaw tight, and for a long moment they simply stood there in the firelight, close enough to feel each other's warmth, not touching, the unspoken thing between them humming louder than anything either of them said. It was Enzo's voice through the door, low and urgent, that broke the spell. "Boss, you need to see this." Dante's whole demeanour shifted in an instant. The raw, uncertain man dissolving back into the cold, controlled boss she'd first met. And Sophia felt the loss of the other version of him like a physical thing. "Stay here," he told her, and was gone. She didn't stay. She followed as far as the hallway, close enough to hear voices from the study, Dante's, low and clipped, and another man's, older, agitated, and caught fragments through the door left carelessly ajar. Feds, surveillance van, 2 blocks from the Bella Rosa. They've had eyes on Moretti's crew for months, boss, and now they're asking questions about you, too. Her stomach dropped. She knew enough about her father's world, however sheltered she'd been from its daily operations, to understand what those words meant. That the fragile, dangerous bubble she and Dante had built in this house by the lake was about to be punctured by something neither of them could control or negotiate with. The FBI didn't care about blood feuds or 11-year-old grief. They cared about indictments, about warrants, about men in handcuffs on the evening news. She was still standing in the hallway, frozen, when Dante emerged and found her there, and something in his face, grim, calculating, already 3 steps ahead, told her the fragile peace of the past weeks had just run out of time. "How much did you hear?" he asked. "Enough. The FBI is watching Moretti, and you." They've been watching Moretti's crew for 8 months, according to my source. It was only a matter of time before my name came up in whatever wiretaps they've got running. Rocco's not subtle, and he's not smart, and men like that eventually say something incriminating to the wrong informant. He scrubbed a hand over his jaw, and for the first time she saw something that looked almost like fatigue crack through his usual iron composure. "This changes the timeline. If the feds move on Rocco before I've settled things my way, everything I've spent 11 years building toward gets swallowed up in a federal case. And men like Rocco Moretti know how to trade information for a lighter sentence. He'll give up half of Chicago to save himself, and my name will be at the top of the list he hands over." "What does that mean for me?" Dante looked at her for a long moment, something working behind his eyes that she couldn't read. "It means I need to decide, faster than I wanted to, whether keeping you here is protecting you or putting you directly in the blast radius of whatever's about to happen to both our families." His voice dropped. "And it means I need to ask you something I should have asked 3 weeks ago, before any of this got as complicated as it's become." "What?" "If I let you go, right now, tonight, no conditions, straight back to whatever's left of your old life, would you go?" The question hung in the hallway between them, heavier than anything he'd said since the study, the first night, and Sophia found, with a lurch of something that felt like vertigo, that she didn't have an answer. Not a clean one. Not one that didn't terrify her more than the FBI, more than Rocco Moretti, more than anything that had happened since the limousine's headlights had gone dark on that ruined street 3 weeks and a lifetime ago. "I don't know," she said finally, and the honesty of it cost her something, standing there in the hallway with the firelight from the library still warm at her back. 3 weeks ago, I would have run the second that door opened. I would have run and not looked back, and I wouldn't have felt guilty about it for a single second. And now? Now, I don't know what I'm running from anymore, or what I'd be running toward." She wrapped her arms around herself, though the hallway wasn't cold. "My father sold me to a family that was always going to discard him the moment he stopped being useful. My husband, if I can even call him that after 3 weeks of never once seeing his face again, sends letters that sound like concern but read like ownership once you look closely enough. And you—" She stopped, throat tight. "And me," Dante said, quiet, waiting. "You took everything from me at gunpoint, and somehow you're the only person in this whole nightmare who's asked me what I want, instead of telling me what I have to be." She looked up at him, and the vulnerability in her own voice frightened her more than anything Rocco Moretti or the FBI could threaten. "That should terrify me more than it does. I know that. I know exactly how insane it sounds, and I don't have a good answer for you, Dante, because the honest one is that I don't want to leave. And I hate that I don't want to leave, and I don't know what that says about me. Something in his face broke open at that. Not the careful cracks of the library, not the controlled admission by the fire, but something total, undone. A man who had spent 11 years building a wall around every soft thing left in him, watching that wall come down in real time. "It says," he said, voice rough, "that you're smarter than either of the men who claim to love you, because you can tell the difference between being kept and being chosen, even when the man doing the choosing did everything wrong to get here. Is that what this is? You choosing me?" "I chose you the second night," he admitted, and the confession seemed to cost him everything he had left. "When you asked me who gave me the right to touch you, and I realized I didn't have an answer that didn't make me exactly the kind of man I promised myself I'd never become. The kind who takes what he wants and calls it justice. I've spent every day since trying to become someone who deserves to be in the same house as you, instead of the man who put you here." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and unguarded, and Sophia felt something in her chest crack wide open in response. 3 weeks of fear and grief, and a strange, unwilling tenderness, all crashing together into something she no longer had the strength or the desire to fight. She closed the distance this time. His hands came up to frame her face, as though he'd been waiting 3 weeks for permission. And when their lips met, it wasn't gentle. It was 3 weeks of restraint breaking all at once, of grief and anger and a hunger neither of them had let themselves name, and Sophia felt herself come undone in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a truth she'd been running from since the moment she first saw him across that fire-lit study. His hands slid into her hair, careful of the healing wound at her scalp, even in the middle of losing himself entirely. And she felt, for the first time since the wedding, something that wasn't dread or grief or the numb, floating shock of survival. She felt wanted, chosen, seen, in a way that 8 months of an arranged marriage had never once offered her. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing hard, foreheads resting together in the low light of the hallway, Dante's hands still cradling her face like something he was afraid to lose, he said, low and rough, "I meant what I said, not while you're still my prisoner. That still stands, Sophia. This doesn't mean I'm not going to give you the choice to walk away, whatever it costs me. And if I choose to stay, then God help us both," he said, and there was something almost like a smile in it now, dark and helpless and entirely undone, "because I don't know how to protect you from what's coming and love you at the same time, without one of those things costing me the other." The word love landed between them like something neither of them had planned to say aloud, too soon, too fast, too dangerous, given everything still bearing down on them from every direction, but neither of them took it back. Sophia stood in the hallway of a house she'd been dragged to at gunpoint, in the arms of the man responsible for the worst night of her life, and understood, with a clarity that terrified her, that she had already made her choice, weeks ago, somewhere between the library fire and a stack of books that belonged to a dead boy named Gianni, and that nothing left to come, not her father, not Michael, not Rocco Moretti, Not even the FBI closing in from every side was going to be enough to talk her out of it now. The peace, such as it was, lasted 4 days. It ended with a phone call that Dante took in the study with the door shut, and Sophia, waiting in the hallway with her heart in her throat, the way she'd waited that first terrible night, watched his face when he finally emerged, and knew before he said a word that whatever fragile future they'd begun building in the dark had just been given a deadline. "Rocco wants a meeting," Dante said. "Neutral ground. The old distillery on Ashland, midnight tomorrow. He says he'll bring proof of good faith. I don't trust a single word out of that man's mouth. But if I refuse, he takes it as confirmation that I'm hiding something worth hiding, and he escalates in ways I can't predict. You're not going alone. I'm not taking you within 10 miles of that building, if that's where this sentence was headed." "That's not what I meant." She crossed her arms, some of her father's old stubbornness surfacing in her voice despite everything. "I meant you're not going without backup, without a plan. I've heard my father talk about men like Rocco Moretti my whole life, Dante. They don't call meetings on neutral ground because they've had a change of heart. They call them because it's easier to kill a man when he thinks he's safe." Something in Dante's expression softened, just slightly, at the fierce protectiveness in her voice. She watched him notice it, watched him file it away like something precious. "I'll have 6 men in position before he arrives. I'm not walking into that distillery blind, Sophia, but I am going, because the alternative is worse. Rocco escalating against your father, against this house, against you, out of spite for being ignored." "What proof of good faith is he supposed to be bringing?" "I don't know." Dante's jaw tightened. "That's what worries me most." She spent the next 24 hours in a state of low, grinding dread that made the earlier weeks of captivity feel absurdly, almost peaceful by comparison. At least then the danger had been abstract, distant, something Dante managed on her behalf while she waited safely inside these walls. Now it had a date and a location and a man's name attached to it, and she understood, with a clarity that frightened her, that she had crossed some invisible line from prisoner to something else entirely. A woman terrified of losing the man who'd taken her. She found Rosa in the kitchen the evening before the meeting, hands buried in bread dough, and the domestic ordinariness of the scene, flour dusting the counter, the radio playing low, a pot of sauce simmering on the stove, felt so at odds with the violence gathering outside these walls that Sophia had to steady herself against the doorframe. "You look like you need to talk to someone who isn't him," Rosa said, without looking up. "Is it that obvious?" "Sophia, half this house has been watching you two circle each other for a month." It stopped being subtle around week 2. Rosa's mouth quirked, gentler than her words. "For what it's worth, and I've worked for this family 2 years, so it's worth something, I've never seen him like this. Not with anyone. He used to be the kind of boss who didn't remember which of us had families of our own to get home to. Now he asks me twice a day if you've eaten." That's not exactly reassuring, given everything he's capable of. "No," Rosa agreed, working the dough with more force than it strictly required. "But it's true. Whatever else he is, and I'm not going to pretend I don't know what he is, working in this house, he's not lying to you about how he feels. Men like Dante Russo don't bother lying about the things that actually matter to them. They lie about everything else instead, to protect the one truth they can't afford to have used against them." Sophia thought about that, long after she'd left the kitchen, lying awake in the dark with the lake wind rattling the windows, listening to the muffled sounds of Dante's men preparing for tomorrow's meeting. The low murmur of voices, the metallic click of weapons being checked, the particular tension of a house bracing for violence. She thought about Rosa's words, about Valentina's warning in the club, about her father's letter and Michael's letter, and the terrible, tangled knot of loyalty and fear that had brought her to this house in the first place. And she thought, with a certainty that surprised her by how little it frightened her, that if something happened to Dante tomorrow night, she would not survive it the way she'd survived everything else. Not with steadiness, not with the armor her mother had taught her to wear. She would survive it broken. And she understood, finally, fully, that whatever this was between them, however impossibly it had begun, it had stopped being something she could walk away from weeks ago. When Dante came to her room past midnight, dressed for the meeting in dark clothes that made him look leaner, more dangerous, more like the man from that first terrible night than the one who'd kissed her in the hallway, she didn't ask him not to go. She only crossed the room and kissed him again, slow and fierce and frightened, memorizing the shape of him with her hands the way she hadn't let herself do before. And when he finally pulled back, his forehead resting against hers, breathing unsteady, he said, "If this goes wrong tomorrow, don't," she said. "Don't say it like it's already decided. I need you to know," he pressed on anyway, "that whatever happens, you were never a means to an end, not after the second night. I need you to know that before I walk out that door. Then come back," she said, "and tell me again, so I don't have to spend the rest of my life wondering if you meant it." He kissed her once more, hard and desperate, and then he was gone, and Sophia stood alone in the dark of a room that had stopped feeling like a cage weeks ago and started feeling, terrifyingly, like home. The old distillery on Ashland had been abandoned for a decade, its brick facade streaked black with soot and neglect, its windows boarded or shattered, the kind of place that swallowed sound and light in equal measure, which was, Dante knew, exactly why Rocco Moretti had chosen it. He arrived 20 minutes early, with 2 men visible, and 4 more positioned across the surrounding rooftops, rifles trained on the loading dock where the meeting would take place, and stood in the cold with his hands loose at his sides, cataloguing every shadow, every possible line of fire, the way his uncle had taught him to catalogue a room before he was old enough to shave. Rocco Moretti arrived at midnight exactly, flanked by 4 men, and even across the loading dock's distance, Dante could see the older man had aged since the last photograph in his surveillance file, greyer, heavier, but the eyes were the same, flat and calculating. The eyes of a man who'd built an empire on other men's blood and never once lost sleep over the accounting. "Russo," Rocco's voice carried easily in the empty space, amplified by brick and steel. "You look well for a man who kidnapped a bride off the street. I half expected the stress to show." "Rocco." Dante didn't move from where he stood. "You said you had proof of good faith. I'm listening." Rocco gestured, and one of his men stepped forward with a folder, sliding it across the concrete floor between them until it stopped at Dante's feet. He didn't pick it up immediately, didn't take his eyes off Rocco long enough to give the man an opening. "Open it," Rocco said. "It's the least you owe me." given what your little stunt has cost my family in respect these past weeks." Dante crouched, retrieved the folder, opened it standing, angled so he could watch Rocco and read the contents at the same time. Old habits, older instincts, the ones that had kept him alive 11 years in a business that killed careless men young. The photographs inside stopped his breath entirely. Surveillance images, grainy but unmistakable. His brother, Gianni, 22 years old, sitting across a table from a man Dante recognized instantly, despite the 11 years and the added weight and grey hair. Salvatore Marchetti, Sophia's father. The photographs were time-stamped 3 days before Gianni's death, and beneath them, a transcript, a wire recording, Gianni's young, unguarded voice discussing a shipment, a payoff, a deal Dante had never known existed, a deal brokered not by Rocco Moretti, but by Salvatore Marchetti, using Gianni as the go-between. "What is this?" Dante said, and his voice had gone very quiet, very dangerous, the calm before something catastrophic. "That," Rocco said, and there was something almost like satisfaction in his voice, ugly and triumphant, "is the truth you've been too consumed by grief to go looking for. Your brother wasn't killed by my order, Russo. He was killed because he found out Salvatore Marchetti had been skimming from a shipment meant for both our families and threatened to tell you, and Marchetti panicked and had his own men silence the problem before you got home from Palermo. I found out 2 years ago. I've been sitting on it because it was useful leverage over Marchetti and eventually, I suspected, over you. Once your obsession with punishing my family finally led you somewhere I could use it." The world tilted beneath Dante's feet in a way it hadn't since the day he'd identified his brother's body in a county morgue 11 years ago. He stared at the photographs, at Gianni's face, young and unsuspecting, sitting across from a man who would, within days, arrange his murder and let Dante spend a decade hating the wrong family for it. "You let me believe it was you," Dante said, low, shaking with a fury that had nowhere yet to land. 11 years. You let me hunt you, plan against you, build an entire life around punishing your family for something you didn't do." "I let you believe it," Rocco agreed, unbothered, "because a Russo hunting a Marchetti kept you both weak and distracted, while I consolidated territory neither of you were paying attention to. And it worked beautifully. Right up until you decided to marry my son to Marchetti's daughter and steal her out from under us before the wedding cake was even cut." His smile was thin, satisfied, entirely without warmth. "Consider this a gift, Russo. Redirect that decade of rage where it actually belongs and leave my family out of it entirely. Salvatore Marchetti killed your brother. I only failed to stop him and profited from your ignorance. That's a considerably smaller sin, as sins in this business go." Dante's hands had curled into fists at his sides, and it took every ounce of the discipline his uncle had beaten into him as a boy not to close the distance between them and end Rocco Moretti where he stood, evidence or no evidence, 6 rifles trained on the dock or not. "And Sophia," he said instead, forcing the words out level. "Her father sold her to you to buy his silence. Not his protection, his silence, so you'd never use this against him." "Now you're catching up?" Rocco's smile widened. "Marchetti's been terrified for 2 years that I'd tell you the truth and you'd burn his entire operation to the ground in revenge. The marriage was insurance. tie his blood to mine closely enough, and killing his daughter's father-in-law's family becomes a much messier proposition, even for a man as singularly obsessed as you've become. He turned to leave, gesturing his men back toward the waiting cars. Do what you want with that information, Russo. I only ask that you remember who handed it to you the next time you're deciding which families deserve to survive whatever comes next. Dante stood alone on the loading dock long after Rocco's taillights had vanished into the dark, the folder trembling in hands that had not shaken in 11 years, and understood, with a horror that eclipsed even his grief, that the woman he had fallen in love with was the daughter of the man who had murdered his brother, and that he was going to have to be the one to tell her. He didn't tell her that night. He came home from the distillery just before dawn and found her waiting exactly where he'd left her, curled in the wing chair by the library fire, having refused, Rosa told him quietly in the hall, to sleep until he returned. And the sight of her, safe, unharmed, unaware of the folder still clutched in his hand, nearly undid the careful control he'd spent the drive home rebuilding. "You're back," she breathed, rising from the chair so fast she nearly stumbled, and he caught her, folded her against his chest, and held on longer than the reunion strictly required, breathing in the scent of her hair, memorizing the solid, living warmth of her, because he understood, standing there, that within hours he would have to tell her something that might tear this fragile, impossible thing between them apart forever. "I'm back," he said, voice rough. "I'm fine. Rocco's not going to move against you or your father in the immediate term." "Then why do you look like that?" "Like what?" "Like someone died," she said, quiet, searching his face with the particular attentiveness she'd developed over 5 weeks of learning to read him. "Dante, what happened at that meeting?" He didn't answer immediately. He set the folder on the low table between them and watched her eyes drop to it, watched her register the surveillance photographs on top, her father's face, unmistakable, even grainy and 11 years younger, and felt something in his chest tear open at the confusion crossing her features, the confusion that was about to become something far worse. "Sophia," he said, and made himself say it plainly, because she deserved that much, whatever it cost either of them. "My brother wasn't killed on Rocco Moretti's order. He was killed because your father discovered, because Gianni discovered your father was skimming from a joint shipment and threatened to expose it. Your father had him silenced before I got home from Palermo. Rocco's known for 2 years. He used it as leverage over your father and let me spend 11 years hating the wrong family for my brother's murder." The silence that followed was the worst thing Dante had experienced in 11 years of violence and grief combined. Sophia sank back into the chair, the folder's photographs blurring in front of eyes gone bright with shock, and when she finally spoke, her voice came out as a whisper. "My father killed your brother." "Had him killed, yes. And I—" She looked up at him, and the horror dawning on her face was almost unbearable to watch. "You took me. You took me to punish the Morettis for something my father actually did. I'm his daughter, Dante. I'm the daughter of the man who killed Gianni." Her breath caught, ragged. Is that why? Is any of this?" "No," He crossed to her immediately, dropping to his knees in front of the chair so their eyes were level. Taking her hands in both of his, with a desperation he made no attempt to disguise. "Sophia, look at me. None of what's happened between us has anything to do with your father. I didn't know this an hour ago. Everything I've felt for you, every night in that library, every word I've said to you, happened before I knew any of this, and it doesn't change now that I do." "How can it not change? I'm the daughter of the man who murdered your brother, and I've been sleeping under your roof, falling in love with you, while you didn't know." "You didn't know either," he said fiercely. "You've told me from the first night that you knew nothing about your father's business, and I believed you then, and I believe you now, and nothing about this changes that. You are not your father's crimes, Sophia. I refuse to let you carry them, the same way I refuse to let Gianni's death be something you owe me penance for." "But you spent 11 years planning to destroy the Morettis for this, and it wasn't them. It was my father." Her voice cracked. "What does that mean? What are you going to do?" Dante was quiet for a long moment, his thumbs moving in slow, steadying circles over the backs of her hands. And when he finally spoke, his voice had gone low and rough, with an emotion she'd never heard from him before. Something that sounded almost like fear. "I don't know yet," he admitted. 11 years of my life have been built around a hatred that was pointed at the wrong target, and I don't have a roadmap for what comes next. But I know this." He lifted her hands, pressed a kiss to her knuckles with a tenderness that broke something open in her chest. "Whatever justice looks like for Gianni, it doesn't run through you. I won't let it. I have spent 11 years being the kind of man who lets vengeance decide everything, and it cost me 11 years of a life I could have had instead. And I am not losing you to the same mistake, Sophia. Not now. Not after everything." She was crying now, silent tears tracking down her face, grief and guilt and something that might have been relief tangled together too tightly to separate. "What about my father? Are you going to kill him?" The question hung between them, unanswerable in the moment, too large and too terrible for either of them to hold. Dante didn't lie to her. She would learn, in the weeks that followed, that he never did, not about the things that mattered. But he also didn't have an answer yet that he trusted himself to give. "I don't know," he said again, honestly. "But I promise you this. Whatever I decide, I'll decide it looking at you, not around you. You'll never wake up one morning to find out I made that choice without letting you be part of it. That's the one thing I can promise you tonight." It wasn't enough. Neither of them pretended it was, but it was true. And in a house built on lies and blood and 11 years of misdirected grief, the truth, however painful, was the only foundation either of them had left to stand on. The FBI's presence, which had been a distant rumour for weeks, became undeniable 3 days later, when Dante's lawyer called with news that a grand jury had been convened in the Northern District of Illinois, and that both the Marchetti and Moretti names had surfaced in testimony from a cooperating witness inside Rocco's own organization. "They're building a racketeering case," Dante told Sophia that evening, pacing the length of the study with a restlessness she'd rarely seen from him. "RICO charges, most likely. Conspiracy, money laundering, probably the shipment your father skimmed from, if that witness knows about it. My name's come up peripherally so far, mostly through the club, but peripherally doesn't stay peripheral once they start offering deals." "What happens to my father if they build that case?" Best outcome? He spends the rest of his life in federal prison. Dante's voice was carefully neutral, giving her room to feel whatever she needed to feel without his own opinion crowding the space. Worst outcome? Someone inside Rocco's organization decides your father's testimony is worth more to the feds than his silence is worth to the family, and Rocco has him killed before he can take a plea deal that implicates anyone else. Sophia absorbed that in silence, sitting very still in the wing chair that had become, over the past weeks, unmistakably hers. She thought of her father's cramped, slanting handwriting, his voice telling her 8 months ago that she would marry Michael Moretti, the flicker of relief in his eyes that she'd spent months refusing to name for what it was. She thought about a young man named Gianni Russo, 22 years old, silenced in a drainage ditch to protect that same man's secret. "I don't know how to feel about any of this," she admitted. "I should hate him. I know I should hate him. And some part of me does. For Gianni. For what he did to you. For selling me the way he did. But he's still my father, Dante. He's the only family I have left. And I don't know how to want him punished and still love him at the same time." "You don't have to resolve that tonight." Dante crossed to her, crouching in front of the chair the way he had 3 nights ago when he'd first told her the truth. Grief and anger aren't required to agree with each other. I spent 11 years hating the wrong man because it was simpler than sitting with the complicated truth that grief doesn't always know where to point itself. Don't make that mistake because you think you owe someone a clean answer. It was Marco who interrupted them this time, knocking sharply before letting himself in without waiting for a response, a breach of protocol serious enough that Dante was on his feet before the door finished opening. "Boss, it's Marchetti, Sophia's father." Marco's face was grim. "He's here, at the gate. Alone, no escort, saying he needs to talk to his daughter before the feds pick him up." Sophia was on her feet before she'd consciously decided to move. "Let him in." "Sophia, he's my father, Dante. Whatever he's done, I need to hear this from him myself." She turned to face him, and something in her expression must have convinced him, because after a long, searching moment, he nodded, jaw tight. "He comes in unarmed, searched at the gate, and I'm in the room the entire time," Dante said. "That's not negotiable, whatever else is." Salvatore Marchetti looked smaller than Sophia remembered when Marco brought him into the study 20 minutes later. Greyer, hollowed out, a man visibly collapsing under the weight of choices he could no longer outrun. He stopped just inside the door, taking in his daughter standing beside the man who had orchestrated her kidnapping 5 weeks earlier, and something in his face crumpled. "Sophia, thank God. You look—" He stopped, seemed to register belatedly that she looked healthy, unharmed, standing in a posture that suggested comfort rather than captivity, and something like confusion crossed his features. "You look well." "No thanks to you," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected, armoured in a way that surprised even her. "I know, Papa. I know what you did to Gianni Russo. I know why you sold me to the Morettis." Whatever colour remained in Salvatore's face drained entirely. He looked for one long moment at Dante, and something passed between the two men, old fear meeting new authority, before he looked back at his daughter, and his shoulders sagged in a way that looked, finally, like surrender. I never meant for it to go so far, he said, and his voice cracked on the words. The boy found out about the skimming. I panicked. I told Rocco's men to handle it quietly, and I never, Sophia, I swear to you, I never imagined they'd kill him. I thought they'd scare him into silence. By the time I learned what happened, it was already done, and I was already trapped, and I have spent 11 years paying for a decision I made in 30 seconds of panic, and I am still paying for it. And I am so sorry. I am so sorry it cost you your life too. You sold me, Sophia said, and her voice shook now, all the careful armour cracking at once. You sold me to keep Rocco quiet about what you did. You let me stand at that altar, not knowing any of it. I know. Salvatore's face was wet now, an old man's tears, undignified and real. I know, and there's no version of sorry that undoes it. I came here because the FBI is going to arrest me within days, and I needed you to hear it from me before it happened, rather than from a newspaper or a courtroom. I wanted to tell you I'm sorry, for whatever that's worth to you now. Sophia stood in the middle of the study, caught between 11 years of a grief that wasn't hers and the lifetime of a father's love that had turned out, in the end, to be conditional on his own survival, and found, to her own surprise, that she had nothing left to say to him that wouldn't simply be cruelty for its own sake. "Goodbye, Papa," she said finally, and it was the only mercy she had left to offer. Salvatore Marchetti was arrested 8 days later, taken from his own front steps by federal agents in windbreakers, while news cameras captured every second of it, and Sophia watched the footage once, alone in the library, before she made herself turn off the television and never watch it again. Rocco Moretti was not arrested. That, more than anything, told her how the game was truly being played. That a man like Rocco, with decades more blood on his hands than her father had ever managed, remained free, while Salvatore's smaller, more recent sins were the ones that made the evening news. It was Marco who explained it to her, in his blunt, unadorned way, over coffee in the kitchen one grey morning. Rocco had cooperated, quietly, through lawyers, offering information about smaller players in exchange for his own continued freedom. And Salvatore Marchetti, desperate, cornered, with nothing left to trade, had become exactly the kind of visible, expendable arrest a federal prosecutor needed to show the public results. "It's not justice," Dante told her that evening, watching her stare into the fire with an expression he'd come to recognize as her particular silent grief. No tears, just a terrible stillness. "It's theatre. Rocco's more dangerous than your father ever was, and he'll walk away from this relatively unscathed because he's smarter about who he sacrifices to protect himself." Then what was the point of any of it? Gianni, my father, all of it, if Rocco just gets to walk away clean? "He doesn't get to walk away clean," Dante said, and something in his voice had gone cold and certain in a way that made her look up sharply. "He gets to walk away from federal prosecution. That's not the same thing as walking away from consequences." "Dante," she stood, alarm sharpening her voice, "what are you planning?" He didn't answer immediately, and the silence told her more than words would have. She crossed the room, gripping his forearm with a fierceness that surprised them both. You promised me. You said you wouldn't decide anything about justice without letting me be part of it. This isn't about your father anymore, Sophia. This is about Rocco walking free after profiting from Gianni's death for 2 years, after using that knowledge to manipulate both our families, after threatening you the day I brought you to the Bella Rosa. This is separate from everything else. Is it? Her grip tightened. Or is it just easier to be angry at Rocco than to sit with the fact that the man who actually pulled the trigger, whose men actually pulled the trigger, was my father, and you can't make yourself hate me enough to hate him properly, so you're redirecting all of it back onto the target you're more comfortable with. The accusation landed like a blow, and she watched it land, watched something complicated and pained move behind his eyes as he absorbed the truth in it. Maybe, he admitted finally, low and rough. Maybe that's exactly what I'm doing. I don't know how to carry 11 years of grief without a target for it, Sophia. I've never had to learn. Every day since the distillery, I've felt that hatred looking for somewhere to land, and Rocco's the only person left who feels like he deserves it without complicating everything I feel about you. Then let me help you carry it, instead of carrying it alone into something that gets you killed or arrested. Or worse. Before he could answer, the sound of a car in the drive, too fast, gravel spraying, pulled them both toward the window, and what Sophia saw there stopped her heart cold. 3 black SUVs, no headlights, moving up the estate's long drive with the coordinated speed of men who knew exactly where they were going. That's not Rocco's style, Dante said, already moving, already reaching for the gun he kept in the desk drawer, his voice gone flat and lethal in an instant. He wouldn't come himself. He'd send... The estate's alarm system erupted into a wail that cut him off, and through the window Sophia watched armed men pour from the SUVs, moving with a discipline that told her this was no impulsive act of retaliation, but something planned, coordinated, timed with a precision that suggested inside knowledge of the estate's defences. Sophia. Dante's voice cut through her rising panic, hard and commanding, the voice of the man from that first terrible night, and she understood in that instant that whatever tenderness had grown between them these past weeks, the man capable of the violence that had first brought her here was still very much alive beneath it, and she was grateful for it now, in a way she'd never expected to be. Stay behind me. Don't leave my side. Whatever happens in the next 10 minutes, do not leave my side. Outside, the first gunshots rang out, shattering the fragile peace of the house by the lake, and Sophia realized, with a lurch of terror unlike anything she'd felt even on her wedding night, that the war Dante had spent 11 years preparing for had finally, catastrophically, arrived at their door. The next 10 minutes unfolded in the strange, elongated time of true violence, too fast to process, too slow to survive, without every instinct screaming. Dante pulled Sophia down the back stairs toward the wine cellar, his body angled between her and every window they passed, his gun already drawn, moving through his own house with the grim, economical purpose of a man who had planned for exactly this contingency more times than she wanted to know. Marco has the east perimeter. Enzo has the west, he said, low, urgent, as they descended into the cellar's cool dark. I need 3 minutes to get you secure and get back out there, or my men are going to be outnumbered against whoever Rocco sent. You said this wasn't Rocco's style. It's not, which means someone else authorized this, or Rocco's more desperate than I gave him credit for. He pulled her behind a wine rack into a narrow alcove she hadn't known existed and pressed something cold and heavy into her hands. A handgun, safety off, the weight of it shocking against her palm. "You know how to use this?" "My father made sure I could, growing up. I never thought I'd—" "Point and pull the trigger if anyone comes through that door who isn't me, Marco, or Enzo. Don't hesitate, Sophia. Not for 1 second." He gripped her face with both hands, fierce and urgent, and kissed her once, hard, a promise disguised as goodbye. "I am coming back for you. Do you hear me? Whatever happens up there, I am coming back." Then he was gone, and Sophia was alone in the dark, gun trembling in her hands, listening to the muffled chaos of gunfire and shouting somewhere above her, counting seconds the way she'd once counted breaths to survive a car full of masked men, and understanding, with a clarity that frightened her more than the danger itself, that she was no longer the frightened bride from that first night. Something in her had hardened these past weeks, tempered by grief and fear and a love she hadn't asked for, but couldn't now imagine living without. The gunfire seemed to go on forever. She would learn later it lasted less than 8 minutes. 8 minutes in which Dante's men, better positioned and better prepared than their attackers had anticipated, cut down the assault before it could reach the house's interior, in which 2 of the intruders were killed and a third, captured, wounded, dragged into the study for questioning, while Dante himself, blood on his sleeve from a graze that would leave a scar he'd wear for the rest of his life, went looking for the woman he'd left in the cellar. He found her exactly where he'd left her, gun still raised, hands steady now in a way that told him something had shifted permanently in her during those 8 terrible minutes, and the relief on his face when he saw her unharmed was so raw, so unguarded, that it undid something in her chest entirely. "It's over," he said, crossing the space between them in 3 strides, pulling her against him with a desperation that spoke louder than any words could have. "You're safe. It's over." Who were they? He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally answered, his voice had gone grim, in a way that told her the answer troubled him deeply. "The one we captured says he was hired through an intermediary, doesn't know who employed him, only that the money came from someone inside Rocco's organization who wanted this to look like it came from outside the family. Deniable, untraceable, back to Rocco directly." His jaw tightened. "Which means someone close to Rocco is making moves he doesn't fully control, or Rocco's playing a longer game than even I gave him credit for, positioning himself to claim he had nothing to do with an attack on us while still getting the outcome he wants. Which is you, dead or recovered, me dead or discredited, and a war between our families that the feds can point to as proof of exactly the kind of organized crime chaos that justifies expanding their investigation into territory Rocco's been quietly protecting for years." Dante's expression darkened further. "It's elegant in a monstrous sort of way. He gets to eliminate both of us and hand the FBI exactly the narrative he needs, all without ever dirtying his own hands." Sophia pulled back enough to look up at him, something fierce and unyielding settling into her expression that hadn't been there 5 weeks ago when a masked man had dragged her from a ruined limousine and she'd had nothing left but her mother's old advice about never breaking first. "Then we don't let him," she said. "Whatever it takes, Dante. I'm not losing you to a man who spent this whole time hiding behind other people's blood. Something in his face, love, fear, a fierce and unfamiliar pride, settled into something like resolve, and he pressed his forehead to hers in the cellar's cool dark, both of them breathing hard, alive, together, in the wreckage of a house that had somehow, impossibly, become home. "Then we end it," he said. "Together. No more secrets. No more decisions made without you in the room. That's the only way either of us survives what's coming." The captured gunman gave up a name before dawn, not under torture, though Sophia suspected Dante's men had made the alternative clear enough to loosen his tongue, but in exchange for a promise of a clean death instead of a slow one, a mercy that turned her stomach even as she understood, in this world, it passed for kindness. The name was Antonio Greco. Rocco Moretti's underboss, a man Sophia had met exactly once, briefly, at her own wedding reception. A broad-shouldered figure who had kissed her cheek and murmured congratulations while his eyes stayed flat and assessing, the way she now understood every man in that world's eyes eventually went. Greco's been positioning himself to take over Rocco's operation for at least 2 years, Dante explained, spreading a set of surveillance photos across the study desk with the same grim focus he'd brought to the folder Rocco had given him at the distillery. "My sources say Rocco's health isn't what it used to be. Heart trouble, kept quiet, the kind of thing a man like that hides until it kills him. Greco's been manoeuvring to inherit the throne, and a war between us and Rocco, one that gets Rocco blamed and possibly killed in the crossfire, would clear his path considerably faster than waiting for a heart attack. So he attacked us to provoke you into finishing off Rocco for him." "That's my read, yes." Dante's jaw was tight, which means the real threat was never really Rocco at all, not for a while now. Rocco's dangerous, and he's guilty of a great many things, but he's also, in his own way, been trying to keep this from becoming a full war, because a war is bad for business and worse for a man whose health can't survive prison stress, let alone open conflict. Greco wants the opposite. Chaos benefits him. Sophia studied the photographs. Greco at a restaurant with men she didn't recognize. Greco meeting with someone in a parked car outside a building she now recognized with a jolt as the same warehouse district where her wedding limousine had been ambushed 5 weeks ago. "Wait." She leaned closer, pointing at a timestamp. "This is from before the wedding, before I was even taken." Dante went very still. "Show me." "The ambush," she said slowly, pieces assembling in her mind with a horror that made her voice shake. "You said your men staged it. But what if Greco knew you were planning to take me and let it happen? Or even helped arrange it? Because chaos between our families was exactly what he wanted all along." Dante's face had gone hard and pale in the lamplight, a man recalculating 11 years of careful planning against a variable he'd never considered. "My men who arranged the ambush reported it went smoother than expected, fewer obstacles than they'd planned for, less resistance from your original security detail than intelligence had suggested. I credited good planning at the time." His voice had dropped low, dangerous. "If Greco fed my people information to make the ambush easier, engineered it to succeed specifically so it would spark exactly this kind of conflict, then none of this the ambush, the kidnapping, any of it, was really about Gianni at all in the end. It was Greco, using both of our grief and both of our families to clear his own path to power. The realization settled over the study like a physical weight, and Sophia watched Dante absorb it, watched 11 years of purpose, however misdirected, however painfully redirected in recent weeks, crumble into something that looked, for the first time since she'd met him, genuinely lost. "Then what was any of it for?" he said, quiet, almost to himself. "Gianni's death. Your father's crime, Rocco's silence, all of it just pieces on a board for a man neither of us even considered a threat." "No." Sophia crossed to him, taking his face in her hands the way he'd done for her so many times these past weeks, forcing his eyes to hers. "It wasn't for nothing, Dante. Gianni is still dead. My father is still guilty of what he did. None of that changes because Greco used it. But you don't have to let him decide what happens next. That part is still ours to choose." Something in Dante's expression cleared, sharpened, the lost, unmoored quality replaced by something colder and more purposeful. Not the blind, grief-driven hatred that had brought him to her wedding 5 weeks ago, but something sharper, more precise. The look of a man who finally understood exactly which target deserved the full weight of 11 years' accumulated fury. "Greco," he said, and his voice had gone flat and final, in a way that made the hair rise on Sophia's arms. "It's time he learned what happens to men who use other people's grief as a weapon." The plan that formed over the following 2 days was not, Dante told her plainly, a plan he was proud of. It required reaching out to Rocco Moretti directly, offering an alliance neither man would have believed possible 6 weeks earlier, built on the fragile, shared understanding that Antonio Greco's ambition threatened them both more than their old feud ever had. "Rocco won't trust you," Sophia said, watching Dante prepare for the meeting he'd arranged, this time at a restaurant in the Loop, with witnesses enough on both sides to discourage another ambush. "He doesn't have to trust me. He has to understand that Greco engineered a war neither of us wanted, and that the only way either of us survives with our organizations intact is if we handle Greco together, quietly, before the FBI's case forces both our hands." Dante checked his weapon with the same unhurried precision she'd watched him bring to everything since that first terrible night, though something in his movements now carried a weight she hadn't seen before. The weight, she understood, of a man choosing a different kind of ending than the one he'd spent 11 years preparing for. "I'm not doing this for Rocco, Sophia. I'm doing this because Greco's ambition is the actual threat to everything I've built, to everyone in this house, to you. Rocco is simply useful to that end, the way I was useful to Greco's." "And after? When Greco's dealt with, and this alliance has served its purpose? What happens to Rocco then?" Dante was quiet for a long moment, and when he answered, his voice had gone rougher, more honest than she'd expected. "I don't know yet. Part of me still wants him to answer for what he let happen to Gianni. The silence, the leverage, 2 years of using that secret to manipulate everyone around him. But I've spent 11 years letting vengeance decide who I am, Sophia. And it cost me 11 years I could have spent building something instead of just avenging what I'd lost. I don't want to make that mistake again, not when I finally have something worth building toward instead." She crossed the room and kissed him, slow and certain, and felt him lean into it with a tenderness that still, after 5 weeks, managed to surprise her. This cold, dangerous man who had upended her entire life, kissing her like she was something infinitely precious rather than a prize he'd won. "Come back to me," she said, echoing words she'd said before, weeks ago, in a hallway that felt like a different lifetime now. "Always," he said, and meant it in a way that settled something in her chest she hadn't realized had still been unsteady. The meeting itself, she would learn afterward from Dante's careful, unflinching account, unfolded with the particular tension of 2 predators forced into temporary alliance by a threat neither had anticipated. Rocco Moretti, older and visibly diminished by whatever health trouble he was hiding, listening with narrowed, calculating eyes as Dante laid out the evidence of Greco's engineered chaos, and finally, grudgingly, agreeing that a common enemy required a common response, however distasteful either man found the necessity of it. "He's dying," Dante told Sophia that night, back at the estate. The alliance sealed with nothing more than a handshake and a mutual understanding that could unravel the moment it stopped being useful to either side. 6 months, maybe less, according to my sources. He's not fighting Greco to protect his empire anymore, Sophia. He's fighting to make sure Michael inherits something worth having, instead of a war Greco's already halfway to winning. Michael. Sophia felt the name land strangely, distant now, a stranger's name attached to a life she'd left behind weeks ago. What happens to him in all this? That's not entirely up to me, Dante said carefully. But if Rocco succeeds in stopping Greco, Michael inherits a family that's finally free of the lie about Gianni's death, free of Greco's ambition, and, if Rocco has any sense left in him, free of whatever debt or obligation he still believes he holds over you. I intend to make that last part explicit when the time comes. You're not going back to that marriage, Sophia. Whatever else happens, that part isn't negotiable. Not for Rocco, not for Michael, not for anyone. I wasn't planning to, she said softly. And something in Dante's face, at her certainty, at the easy, unforced conviction in her voice, looked almost undone with relief. 3 nights later, word came that Antonio Greco had been found dead in his own car outside a restaurant on Taylor Street. 2 bullets, professional, untraceable. A killing that would be attributed in the whispered currency of Chicago's underworld to a dozen possible enemies, and that neither Dante nor Rocco would ever publicly claim. Though Sophia understood, watching Dante's face when the news reached them, exactly whose hand had finally closed the account 11 years in the making. "Is it over?" she asked quietly, that night, lying in his arms in the dark, the lake wind moving through the pines outside their window. "Almost," Dante said, pressing a kiss to her hair. "There's still the feds, still your father's case, still 100 loose ends that could unravel everything." His arms tightened around her. "But the part that mattered most, the part where I finally stopped letting a decade-old lie decide who I was going to be, that part's already finished. And I owe that to you, Sophia. Every bit of it." The FBI's case against Salvatore Marchetti proceeded regardless of the underworld's quiet reshuffling, and Sophia found herself, 3 months after her wedding day, sitting in a federal courtroom's gallery, watching her father plead guilty to charges that would keep him behind bars for the better part of 2 decades.
his cooperation with prosecutors, buying him a reduced sentence, but not, in the end, his freedom.
He didn't look at her when the judge read the sentence. She wasn't certain afterward whether that was mercy or cowardice, and she decided, walking out of the courthouse into a cold, bright December afternoon, with Dante's hand steady at the small of her back, that she no longer needed to know which. "You okay?" he asked, once they were in the car, the cameras and reporters who'd gathered outside the courthouse falling away behind them. "I don't know yet." She watched the city slide past the window, grey and indifferent, and found that the grief she'd braced for had arrived, but not in the shape she'd expected. Quieter, more resigned, more like mourning a father she'd lost years before this final legal severing, than like losing him fresh today. "I think I said goodbye to him the day he came to the estate." This just made it official. Rocco Moretti's case fared differently and considerably better than her father's, a testament, Dante told her grimly, to the particular arithmetic of federal prosecution, where the men who could offer the most information about others always seemed to find themselves offered the gentlest terms. He would face lesser charges, a fraction of the sentence her father received, and would likely serve much of it in a minimum security facility better suited to a man in declining health than to the empire he'd built on other men's blood. "It's not fair," Sophia said, when the news of Rocco's plea deal reached them. "No," Dante agreed. "It rarely is in this world. I learned that a long time ago, and I've made my peace with it as much as any man can. Rocco will answer for what remains of his life to something bigger than a federal sentence. Eventually. Everyone does. I'm no longer interested in being the instrument of that reckoning, though. Not after everything it nearly cost me." Michael Moretti, for his part, sent one final letter, not through the untraceable channel that had carried the others, but delivered openly, by his own hand, to the gates of Dante's estate, where he stood, alone and unarmed, and asked only for 5 minutes with the woman who was, technically, still legally his wife, until the annulment Dante's lawyers had already begun filing was finalized. Sophia agreed to see him, against Dante's visible reluctance, in the library where so much of her transformation these past months had taken place. "I wanted to say I'm sorry," Michael said, standing awkwardly near the door, looking younger than she remembered him being, though it had only been 3 months. "For all of it. I didn't know about Gianni Russo, not the truth of it. Not until Greco's death made my father finally tell me everything. I didn't know what my marrying you was actually paying for. I want you to know that, at least." "I believe you," Sophia said, and found to her own quiet surprise that she meant it. That whatever anger she still carried toward the Morettis as a family had never really belonged to Michael individually, a boy as unwillingly conscripted into his father's schemes as she had been into hers. "I hope you find something better than what your father built, Michael. I mean that." "I'm trying to." He managed a small, rueful smile. "Turns out running a family business is a lot less appealing once you understand exactly what it costs the people around you." He glanced toward the door, toward where he clearly understood Dante was waiting, patient and watchful, just out of sight. "He's good to you, Russo?" "He is," Sophia said simply, and something in Michael's face, at the quiet certainty in her voice, settled into something like genuine, unresentful relief. "Then I'm glad," he said, and meant it, and left, without asking for anything more,
than the 5 minutes he'd requested, and Sophia understood, watching him go, that whatever remained of her old life had finally, completely, closed its door behind her.
That night she found Dante on the terrace, looking out over a lake gone dark and silver under a rising winter moon, and came to stand beside him at the railing the way she had that first uncertain evening, weeks and a lifetime ago, when neither of them had yet admitted what was growing between them. "It's really over," she said. "All of it. My father, Rocco, Greco, Michael. There's nothing left unresolved." "Almost nothing," Dante said, and something in his voice made her look up, made her catch the small, uncharacteristic nervousness in his expression that she'd never once seen from him in all the months she'd known him. "What's left?" He turned to face her fully and reached into his jacket, and what he produced was not a weapon, not a folder of surveillance photographs, not anything that belonged to the world of blood and vengeance that had brought them together. It was a small velvet box, and Sophia's breath caught entirely as he opened it to reveal a ring. Simple and elegant, nothing like the ostentatious diamonds she'd worn at her first wedding. Nothing borrowed, nothing bought as payment for someone else's debt. "I know how this started," Dante said, voice rough with an emotion he made no attempt to hide. "I took you at gunpoint on the worst night of your life, and I have spent every day since trying to become a man worthy of what grew between us, despite that. I'm not going to pretend the beginning wasn't unforgivable, but I'm asking you, Sophia, freely with the whole world in front of you and every choice available. Will you marry me?" Not because anyone sold you, not because it settles a debt or seals an alliance. Just because I love you, and I want to spend whatever's left of this dangerous life building something with you, instead of tearing something down.
Sophia looked at the ring, at the man holding it, at the lake spread silver and endless behind him, and felt every fear and grief and impossible tenderness of the past 3 months converge into a single, unhesitating certainty. "Yes," she said, and the word came out steady, sure, nothing like the trembling voice that had demanded his name that first terrible night. "Yes, Dante. 1,000 times, yes." They were married in the spring, in the garden behind the estate, with the lake calm and blue beyond the tree line, and none of the pageantry that had marked her first wedding. No cathedral full of men counting favours, no father walking her down an aisle toward a debt disguised as a marriage.
Rosa arranged flowers she'd grown herself in the estate's greenhouse over the winter. Marco and Enzo stood at the edges of the small gathering, not as guards this time, but as something closer to family. And Valentina, of all people, came and cried harder than anyone, and told Sophia afterward, with a wet, unguarded laugh, that she'd never once expected to see Dante Russo look at anyone the way he looked at her. There was no priest reciting words neither of them had chosen, no contract disguised as a sacrament. Dante had written his own vows and read them with a rawness that undid the last of Sophia's careful composure, speaking of a man who had spent 11 years mistaking vengeance for purpose, until a woman in a ruined wedding dress had taught him, without ever meaning to, what he'd actually been missing all along. I used to think love was a weakness, he said, holding both her hands, the lake wind lifting the edges of her simple ivory dress, nothing like the $11,000 gown that had started this impossible story, and infinitely more precious to her for its simplicity. I built my entire life around the belief that the only thing that couldn't be taken from you was the thing you never let yourself want in the first place. You took that belief apart, one library evening at a time, Sophia, without ever once trying to. I don't know how to thank you for that, except to promise you the rest of my life and every version of myself I have left to become. Sophia's own vows were shorter, simpler, spoken through tears she made no effort to hide this time. You took everything from me on the worst night of my life, she said, and somehow, impossibly, gave me back more than I ever had before you did. I don't know how to explain that to anyone who wasn't there for it. I only know that I choose you, Dante. Not because anyone sold me, not because I have nowhere else to go, but because you're the only home I've ever actually wanted to stay in. I love you. I choose you, today and every day after. They didn't move away from the estate afterward, though Dante offered more than once to build her a life somewhere untouched by the violence that had first brought them together. Sophia found, to her own surprise, that she loved the house by the lake, loved the library where their whole impossible story had really begun, loved the fire that Rosa still kept lit day and night, out of a habit none of them had ever quite explained, loved the wide lawn where 2 years later she would watch a dark-haired little girl with her father's serious eyes take her first unsteady steps toward the water's edge, Dante's hand hovering close, but not quite touching, giving his daughter, as he'd once given her mother, exactly enough freedom to find her own footing. The federal case against what remained of the Marchetti and Moretti organizations ground on for years, slowly, unglamorously, the way such things did. Indictments and plea deals, and men going quietly to prison in the anticlimactic aftermath of violence that had once seemed to Sophia larger than anything the law could touch. Rocco Moretti died 18 months after his sentencing in a prison infirmary of the heart condition he'd hidden from everyone but his own doctors. Michael, freed at last from his father's shadow, sold what remained of the family's legitimate businesses and moved to Colorado, and sent, every year on Sophia's birthday, a card with nothing more than, "I hope you're happy," written inside. And she always was, and always wrote back to tell him so. Dante's world changed too, slowly, deliberately, in ways that surprised even the men who'd known him longest. Fewer meetings, conducted with a gun on the table. More of his considerable fortune redirected into legitimate ventures. The Bella Rosa's back office traded for boardrooms where the only casualties were competitors' quarterly earnings. He never fully left the world that had made him, not entirely. Some debts, he told Sophia once, quietly, on a night when old grief surfaced unexpectedly. Some debts didn't disappear just because a man decided he wanted a different life. But he built something worth protecting instead of something worth avenging, and that, Sophia had come to understand, was the only kind of redemption a man like Dante Russo was ever going to get, or need. On the anniversary of that first terrible night, the ambush, the ruined gown, the cold study, and the man who'd told her, without a flicker of hesitation, that she was going to be there for a very long time, Sophia found Dante on the terrace, exactly where she'd found him so many times before, looking out over a lake that had witnessed the entire impossible arc of their story. "Do you ever think about it?" she asked, coming to stand beside him, their daughter asleep inside, the house behind them warm and golden and entirely, finally, a home instead of a cage. That night, how it all started. "Every year," Dante admitted, drawing her against his side, his lips pressing to her hair with a tenderness that still, after everything, undid her completely. "I think about the moment I told you that you'd be here a long time, and how I meant it as a threat, and how it turned out to be the truest promise I've ever made. I think about how close I came to losing everything that actually mattered, chasing vengeance for something I didn't even understand yet." He tightened his arm around her. "Mostly, I think about how grateful I am that you never let me stay the man I was that first night." "However this began, Sophia, whatever price we both paid to get here, I would make every choice exactly the same if it meant ending up standing here with you tonight." Sophia turned into him fully, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady, certain beat of a heart that had once been closed to everything but grief and vengeance, and thought of a girl in a ruined wedding gown who had believed that first terrible night that her life was over. It hadn't ended. It had only just, impossibly, begun. The lake moved silver and endless beyond the terrace, keeping its old secrets the way it always had, and the house behind them settled into the particular quiet of a home built, finally, on something stronger than fear. Built, instead, on the fragile, hard-won truth that even in the coldest hearts, in the most dangerous of men, love could still find its way in, if you were patient enough and brave enough and willing to stay through every long, uncertain night it took to get there.